Hey guys, so this is mainly for A-Day who didn't get a chance to do this in class, so I'm just trying to pick things up from where we left off. So you need two things with you right now. You need your economic choices chart, which you got in class, and you should have basically done a good chunk of it on your own. And then there is a Wilson's 14 points note-taking sheet that is posted on Canvas. You're going to need that in a little bit as well. All right, so skipping that. So we started talking about Wilson's challenge of businesses, right, and how he makes sure that he can find enough materials to equip not only an army but his entire nation. And so you had all these different options. Let's talk about what they actually did. All right, so the big thing is the War Industries Board, or WIB, is created. Um, if we look back at the options that we were talking about, the first one and last option were not good, right? Essentially, just let the market do everything. That's a bad idea. Prices would skyrocket. It wouldn't work. You probably have shortages of key items, right? Um, as opposed to the other option, which is have the government completely take over absolutely everything. Again, that's not going to go well either because then the government's expanding its size. They're not experts in making things. You're better off trying to find that middle ground, which is certainly what B and C offered. So the big thing we want to talk about is how do they ensure production? So the first thing you'll notice is um, they basically gave out large, huge contracts to companies to produce things they needed for the war. Great example right here is the beef industry saw 600% profit. Now, why give away such gigantic contracts? Well, I don't know. Wouldn't you want a contract that led to 600% profit too? So the idea would be then it would give these companies incredible power, or it's not power, incentive to kind of work to do the work to get things done. The other problem is this as well. Um, we spent the last 2 decades with trust busting and limiting companies and their power, and suddenly this is going to kind of begin to give them a lot more power. Government and companies are beginning to cozy up with one another again, and that will have big impacts in the 1920s. So, sorry, progressive era, you're beginning to lose some of your momentum here. Now, in terms of things that are a little bit more controlling and restricting, um, rationing, which is essentially this idea that you certain items are no longer for sale; they have to be acquired with a coupon. Once your coupons run out of whatever it is, it could have been something like clothing or it could have been food. You don't get anymore. And the idea was that it ensured that everyone had the basics to survive, but it also made sure that the wealthy or the connected, their influence were more limited than that. Um, Also, rationing kind of helped push prohibition through. Again, that would be the banning of production and manufacturing of alcohol, because so many of the key products in making alcohol are grains and other products like that that are better suited for war efforts. So suddenly alcohol is not being made. You take the products from there and you push them someplace else. So this is also going to push that stuff. Now, the last thing, oh, and it's a little cut off. You probably can't see it, but down here at the bottom, you will notice it says government expanded from 1%, and that says to 23%. You won't be able to see that. I guess it's too big. So government, in terms of its size and spending, is just gigantic. It goes from basically being basically no part of the economy to basically being the dominating force. All right, next big problem is how do you pay for the war? Again, we had three options here: increase taxes, just try to sell bonds, or do nothing and just hope it all works out. Well, the government didn't do nothing. They did stuff. All right. But sort of it's a combination of all three things because if you look at that one down here, it says borrow money. That's what they did as well. So, what we're talking about is financing the war without huge debt, which the problem is there's no way to do that. So first thing they did was they sold war bonds. War bonds are basically government-backed and guaranteed investments. So hypothetically, you could buy a $10 war bond in like 20 years it'd be worth like 30 or $40. It's a really good investment. It's secure. It's safe. No matter what, you will get your money as long as you're willing to wait it out. Right now, here's the problem with bonds: you eventually got to pay them if you're the government, right? Like this is creating what we call those future me problems. So just kick that can down the line. So yeah, bonds will be helpful. They will be a part of the problem or the solution. Sorry, but the real issue is that you can't sell enough bonds to pay for this war. Wars are just way too expensive. So then you're going to have to find other ways of doing it. So one of the other common ways of doing it was corporate taxes, which that might seem like a bad thing to do, but keep in mind you're giving away insane contracts to these people. You can basically tell them, hey, stop whining. Like you're getting 600% profit in the beef industry, and I want to take some of that back so that I can pay for the war. Yeah, I don't want to hear it from you. And so that's what they did. All right. They doubled the income tax again. That was only on the wealthy. It was not on the poor average person. So they're beginning to go after these people, the wealthier elites or the corporate side. But again, they're still cutting a pretty big break and they're giving lots of benefits. And then the last thing, the obvious thing is this: none of that will pay for the entire war. So you're going to need to take on debt. And so the US, along with many other nations, will take on massive amounts of debt because of World War One, which will have long lasting effects and help push us on the path towards not only the Great Depression, but also World War Two. All right, the last problem was labor. All right, we'll skip all these options. But basically, here's what we want to know. All right, National Board Labor Board. That was kind of this middle ground of you can't just let the free market, you can't just let the workers have everything. You got to kind of meet in the middle. And so we want to avoid work stoppages. Why? Because if work stops, right, suddenly production stops, and then you don't maybe have guns or bullets for your soldiers. You don't have food or necessities for people at home. You cannot afford a work stoppage. So the National War Labor Board wasn't really a government agency. It was a collection of labor representatives and company representatives, and it basically gave much more power and rights to labor unions. As you can see, allowed labor to organize. Membership increased 50%. So this is a huge step forward for labor. Go back to when we talked about the Gilded Age, where those guys the labor unions are literally being shot to death by the government or private people like the Pinkerton detectives. Now the government is giving them their full legal support, and union membership is going to explode. Other things that get created out of this, all right? In order to make sure the labor was treated fairly, they created 8-hour workdays. They provided overtime, which is, not only do you make your base wage, but you make an extra percentage on top of it if you work beyond 8 hours a day. Now, it also gave the government the ability to step in if they felt union leaders were getting too aggressive and too demanding. Again, their goal here is to stop labor strikes, to keep production going. And so they want to work with both sides, but labor definitely wins out here a lot. And that's going to make a big difference in terms of like the treatment of workers going down the line. Now, a couple of things that the war impacted the U.S. A couple of things to keep in mind here. We tend to think of World War One being very much a European war. We think of its impact being massive on them in terms of casualties and losses, and we certainly suffered as well. But the impact of World War One in the United States is more of a social, cultural shift and change, and that's what we're going to talk about right now. So, first thing, the Committee on Public Information, or CPI. This was basically America is producing propaganda. Why is that significant? Because there's an expression which we see in full force during World War II is something called total war. Um, the idea is that the government does everything in its power to ensure victory. And so sometimes that is the things we talked about in terms of financing, production, and all that. There's that. But there's also this idea that you need to, I don't want to hate, I hate to use the word, but manipulate the public into thinking a certain way. So the CPI was basically tasked with a very difficult thing of unifying the country in this effort of war. We later on in history we'll see something like Vietnam where the country isn't united and we're still kind of suffering the consequences of that division now. But the US government understood that you need to get everybody on the same page. So what kind of stuff are they doing, right? So press releases. What does that mean? It's when the government says, here's what we want the public to know, and they give it to newspapers or radio stations. All right. It's basically like a cheat sheet of here's what we're saying. They actually went as guidelines is generous. Guidelines is kind of a euphemism here. They would literally squash or prevent articles that they felt were damaging. And so basically, if you were saying something negative about the government or something that might undermine people's, commitment to the war, that newspaper would not be allowed to publish that article. All right, they made some short films, but that's not no one's really going to see those because there's not a lot of them. And then they, oddly enough, created the 4 Minute Men. That's it's a fun name. Anyway, they were designed to go and give these kind of like very raw speeches to help sell war bonds, but also keep people united. So this stuff isn't that bad, you know. Yeah, suppressing the press and trying to control people's viewpoints. That's not the best, but we're about to get a lot worse. All right, so basically, I'm going to summarize this. I don't think you really need to get all of it down, but here's the big stuff I want you to get down. Okay, so these are basically laws that were designed to, particularly the Espionage Act. If you were deemed to be interfering with the war effort, you could be thrown in jail. What did that mean? Famously, the court, what happens is the group of people start publishing these pamphlets and putting them in the mail that basically discourage people from going to the draft or signing up for the draft or enlisting in the army. The people behind that were arrested under the Espionage Act. So they were interfering with the war effort. So here's a problem. Don't you, as a constitutional right, have the ability to say things like that? Yep. But the Espionage Act basically stripped that away from you. And as you can see from the penalties, were pretty severe. Now, as you might imagine, somebody's going to sue. And we see that in Schenck versus the US in 1918, who basically says, you're violating my constitutional rights. I have freedom of speech, press, blah, blah, blah. Supreme Court says, and this is a dangerous statement here, that they upheld the law because there is a, quote, clear and present danger. The country is in a time of war, is in a clear and present danger. We can do what we got to do. That's really dangerous. The reason it's be really dangerous is because we're going to see that used and applied and used to justify putting the Japanese and Japanese Americans in camps during World War II. Sedition Act, same idea. Can't speak out against the government. If you could, if you did, you get thrown in jail. Eugene Debs, we'll talk more about that guy in a second. He famously spoke out repeatedly about the war and got thrown in jail. So the big thing we want to know here, the big takeaway from this is, please jot this down. When we go to war, we get really scared and we start trying to limit people's rights. And here's another example. The first one we talked about was the quasi-war with France, an Alien and Sedition Act. We're seeing it again in World War I. We'll see it again in World War II. Now, besides cultural changes in terms of the nature of government or government changes and economic changes, there's two big, massive cultural changes. African Americans. Now, there is this notion. Sorry, let me rephrase it. I'm sorry. There's this idea that African Americans could have legitimately stayed home and not participated in the war, and that would have seemed right. Because think about everything was going on in the South, lynchings, all these things that begin to emerge. Why would you enlist? And so here's the thing. W. Du Bois down here supported the war because he felt that if we went and if they went and fought in the war and they participated, that it would garner respect, they would show their love of country, and then out of that would come civil rights, equal rights. That's that's a nice idea. We'll see the same idea again in World War II. The bigger thing I want you to focus on right here is the Great Migration. Because the war took so many people off the front lines to go and fight, that opened up a lot of jobs, particularly in northern factories. So what's going to happen is blacks in the South will move into cities in the South, but more importantly, to cities in the North. Unfortunately, they will face incredible discrimination and at times violence. And we'll talk about it more a little bit later in the unit, but it's going to lead to a gigantic spike in the KKK, not just in the South, but just everywhere. Now, women. Obviously, women are going to take on a large role here as well. We'll see the famous stuff from World War II, like Rosie the Riveter. But more importantly, here's the thing we want to get out of this. Women did important work for the war, and they're rewarded for it, right? I'm just trying to wrap this up as fast as I can. If you look down here, right? So, yes, women served as nurses and did office work, traditional female roles. They took on jobs in factories and farming when men went and vacated them to go and fight in the war. And then there was that kind of community service stuff of blood drives, war bond sales, victory gardens, all that stuff. So women did all those things. And by doing all these things, women get, quote, rewarded. I hate to use that word, but because it had been a long struggle and fight for it. But one of the major cause and effects of World War I in terms of a shifting American culture is the passage of the 19th Amendment. It wasn't the only thing, but it was that kind of big final push. Women said, look what we did to help in the war effort. Give us our right to vote, and we'll finally. And so they do. So the war ends, the amendment passes that same year, and then women are voting in 1920. So the legacy of this is that essentially World War I is one of the major factors that got women the right to vote. It helped to change the demographics of the United States, where blacks who were concentrated in the South begin to head north. But there's that nasty backlash we'll talk about in the 1920s. All right, on to the next part.